Welcome to today's 5-minute professional learning bite presented by CAPITALISE Education. In today's learning bite, we're going to look at how we can apply the UDL framework to the planning, teaching and assessment cycle for students on the autism spectrum. Before we can start thinking about the UDL framework and how we will apply it to the planning, teaching and assessment cycle, we need to identify the characteristics of our students on the autism spectrum. However, identifying the characteristics by themselves is not enough. We actually have to be able to identify the functional impact of those characteristics, because it's the functional impact that we're addressing, not the characteristics. Once we have identified the characteristics of our students on the autism spectrum, the functional impacts at school, we can then start thinking about which UDL checkpoints we'll be applying to the planning, teaching and assessment cycle. Before we can start thinking about how the UDL framework will be applied to the planning, teaching and assessment cycle for students on the autism spectrum, we need to contextualize this within our hypothetical student. Our hypothetical student doesn't understand when and how to interact in social situations. The functional impact this has at schools is that other students don't want to work with the student in the classroom or playground. We can then use the functional impact to look at the UDL framework and identify some relevant checkpoints. In this case, we could look at checkpoint 8.3, fostering collaboration. Our hypothetical student also has difficulties with receptive language. This means that the student is unable to follow verbal instructions in class. He struggles to understand the terminology used in geography. Now that we've identified the functional impact, we can go to the UDL framework and look at some of the checkpoints that would be useful in supporting the student. We could look at checkpoint 1.2. We could look at offering alternatives for auditory information. We could also look at checkpoint 2.1, which is clarifying vocabulary and symbols for our student. We could do this through illustrating information via multiple media, which is checkpoint 2.5. We could also highlight patterns, critical features, big ideas, and relationships in information, which is checkpoint 3.2. Our hypothetical student is hypersensitive to loud noises. This means that when there is a loud noise in the classroom, the student runs out of the classroom and down to the front of the school. Knowing this functional impact, we can look at our UDL framework and identify any relevant checkpoints. In this case, checkpoint 7.3 might be useful. We could look at minimizing threats and distractions in the classroom. Another characteristic of our student is that they are disorganized. This means our student is always late for the class, never ready for the lesson, still getting ready and packing up when other students have finished. Now that we've identified this functional impact, we can then go to the UDL framework and look at relevant checkpoints. In this case, 9.2 might be useful. We could support the student to develop personal coping skills and strategies. 6.1 might also be a useful checkpoint around guiding appropriate goal setting. Our hypothetical student always wants to talk and read about Minecraft. This has led to our student refusing to engage with the Australian curriculum, rather spending all day talking about Minecraft. Now that we've identified the functional impact, we can look at the relevant checkpoints, and 7.2 might be useful. We could look at how we could optimize relevance, value, and authenticity for our student. Our final characteristic for our student is that every 5 minutes, the student stands up and walks around the edge of the classroom. Functional impact is that the student is unable to demonstrate the Australian curriculum achievement standards. Now that we've identified the functional impact, we can look at the UDL framework and identify some relevant checkpoints. In this case, checkpoint 4.1 would be useful. we could look at varying the methods for responsive navigation for our student. Now that we've identified the characteristic, functional impact, and relevant checkpoints from the UDL framework that could support our student on this autism spectrum, we need to start moving into the planning process. This is where the research of Vygotsky comes in. He claimed that the learning growth is the distance between the actual development level as determined by independent problem solving and the level of potential development as determined through problem solving under adult guidance or in collaboration with more capable peers. And we'll be applying this process to our planning. This quote from the movie Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse illustrates Vygotsky's theory. We are a team, me as the teacher who can do it, you as the student who can do it, just not as well. This quote really highlights the concept of the zone of proximal development developed by Vygotsky. Vygotsky argued that there were 4 steps in the zone of proximal development where a student moves from what they can do by themselves into what they can do with others before they develop it internally. He argued that the first stage is contextualization, contextualizing the learning a student is going to do. The second step is the process where the teacher engages in scaffolding. The third step is collaborative group work. And the fourth step is when the student internalizes the learning themselves. This is illustrated by a quote from Vygotsky, "Through others, we become ourselves." Let's have a look at how the planning process developed by Vygotsky can be applied to the UDL framework. During the planning, teaching, and assessment cycle, principle 1 of engagement flows through everything. Vygotsky talked about the first stage as being contextualization, where the teacher contextualizes the learning. This applies to principle 2 of the UDL framework, representation. The second step, teacher scaffolding, also relates to the principle 2 of the UDL framework around representation. Teachers representing information to students in multiple ways. The third step in Vygotsky's learning process is group work. This is where principle 3 of the UDL framework, action and expression, starts to become involved. The final step, internalization, also involves the third step or the third principle in the UDL framework, action and expression, because in the last 2 steps of the learning process, students demonstrate what they know and understand in multiple ways. This is a way of looking at how we can embed the UDL checkpoints into the 4 stages of contextualization, teacher scaffolding, group work, and internalization. This table is useful because we can go back to our UDL checkpoints that we identified earlier and include them where they fit appropriately within Vygotsky's learning process. During the planning process, I go back to the UDL checkpoints that I identified earlier, and I identify which ones I believe would fit most effectively within the area of contextualization. As you can see, the checkpoints come from principles 1 and principles 2 of the UDL framework. I then move on to the teacher scaffolding stage of Vygotsky's process. I go back to the UDL checkpoints that I identified earlier and identify which ones would be appropriate for this stage of Vygotsky's learning process. As you can see, many are the same as the contextualization stage. They also, once again, come out of principles 1 and 2 of the UDL framework. I then follow the same process again, this time for the third stage of Vygotsky's learning process, group work. I go back to the UDL checkpoints that I identified earlier, and I looked at which could be applied to this stage, and I use them in my planning here. Moving into the 4th stage of Vygotsky's learning process, where students work individually and internalize their learning. Once again, I go back to the checkpoints from the UDL framework that I identified, and I identify the ones that would be most appropriately used here, and I apply them to this stage of the learning process. By following this systematic process, identifying the characteristics, functional impact, and UDL checkpoints I use to support my student on the autism spectrum and how they fit within the 4 stages of Vygotsky's learning process, I've now developed a lesson or series of lessons applying the UDL framework. That is today's 5-minute professional learning presented by CAPITALISE Education. At CAPITALISE Education, we believe that teachers achieve a lot more together than they do in isolation. As the African proverb goes, if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.